The story did not begin with an official announcement or a verified statement from a studio. It began with a video that spread rapidly across social media, claiming that Hollywood had lost one of its quiet architects, Rob Reiner. In the clip, viewers were told that the industry seemed to slow by a single beat, as if the machinery of filmmaking itself had paused to absorb a loss too heavy to name. Whether interpreted as rumor, dramatized tribute, or symbolic farewell, the narrative immediately activated something deeper than news. It tapped into memory, into the emotional muscle built by decades of stories that shaped how audiences learned to laugh, love, and listen. According to the video's narration, the funeral was private, intimate, almost deliberately hidden from the spectacle that usually surrounds Hollywood departures. A small chapel, no cameras, no press statements, only white flowers, candlelight, and those who were said to have truly known Rob Reiner. The absence of verification was replaced by atmosphere. Silence did the work that facts usually do. This was not presented as a report. It was framed as a moment, an emotional truth rather than a legal one, designed to make the viewer feel as though they were standing just inside the doorway, allowed to witness something sacred and unrepeatable. At the center of the story stood Billy Crystal, not as a performer, but as a man carrying visible weight. The video lingered on his movements, his hesitation, the way he supposedly stood before speaking, as if courage itself were something he had to search for. What followed was described not as a eulogy, but as a confession. The word choice mattered. Confession implies guilt, delay, something left unsaid until it was too late. In that framing, Billy Crystal was not honoring a colleague. He was confronting a personal failure, or at least the fear of one. This is where the sad structure reveals itself clearly. The first act does not argue about truth. It establishes emotional authority. By slowing the pacing, by describing breath, posture, silence, the video invites the audience to suspend skepticism. Viewers are encouraged to listen not with the mind that checks sources, but with the part that remembers scenes from when Harry met Sally, moments when dialogue felt ordinary, yet somehow permanent. The logic is subtle, but powerful. If the films felt real, then the grief behind them must also be real. The narration emphasizes that what Billy Crystal shared was not meant for the public. Private phone calls, unanswered messages, plans postponed with the casual promise of later. One line in particular is engineered to anchor the entire first section. I thought we still had time. It is not attributed to a transcript or a recording. It exists as a cinematic line, shaped to echo inside the viewer long after the video ends. In sad terms, this is the hook. It transforms a claimed event into a universal fear. Time assumed, time wasted, time that does not come back. Importantly, the video avoids immediately defining Rob Reiner as a legend or icon. Instead, it presents him as presence. Someone who asked one simple question, "Are you okay?" and then waited for the answer. This framing strips away Hollywood glamour and replaces it with something more intimate. It suggests that the real loss is not a filmography, but a human rhythm now missing from the lives around him. The industry did not lose a director. A person lost a listener. For sad, this opening serves a specific function. It draws the audience into complicity. By the end of part one, viewers are no longer asking whether the story is verified. They are asking whether they themselves have postponed a reply, delayed a call, trusted that later would always be available. That emotional pivot is deliberate. It ensures that what follows, whether analysis, clarification, or deeper context, lands on a prepared surface. At the core of this architecture is relationship framing. The video does not present Rob Reiner primarily as a director, producer, or Hollywood figure. Instead, it presents him as a private constant in someone else's life. The decision to center the narrative through Billy Crystal is not incidental. Billy Crystal occupies a unique space in the public imagination. He is known for humor, warmth, and accessibility. He is perceived not as distant celebrity royalty, but as someone audiences feel they have grown up with. When a story is filtered through a voice like his, skepticism weakens. Viewers are inclined to believe not because evidence is presented, but because emotional credibility has already been earned over decades. The transcript repeatedly emphasizes small, human details, exact timing of phone calls, brief messages sent after performances, a single recurring question, "Are you okay?" These details are not there to inform. They are there to authenticate. In narrative psychology, specificity creates truthiness. The more ordinary the habit, the more believable the bond. By focusing on routine rather than grand gestures, the story positions Rob Reiner as someone deeply embedded in the emotional lives of others, not as someone defined by accolades or box office numbers. This is where the sad framework becomes visible as a system rather than a style. The sadness is not explosive. It is cumulative. Each remembered habit becomes another brick laid onto the same emotional structure. The viewer is slowly guided toward a conclusion without ever being directly told what to feel. Loss is not announced. It is assembled. Part 2 also introduces a crucial tonal shift. The narrative moves from public grief into private unease. The story begins to suggest that beneath Rob Reiner's calm exterior existed a prolonged, unresolved anxiety. The subject of fatherhood enters the frame, and with it, fear. Not the fear of career failure or public scandal, but the fear of being unable to protect someone you love. This transition is critical. It reframes the entire tragedy. The pain is no longer about death alone. It is about helplessness that preceded it. Here, the video carefully walks a dangerous line. It introduces deeply sensitive family struggles, addiction, and parental doubt, while maintaining a tone of compassion rather than accusation. The language avoids certainty. Words like worried, feared, and wondered dominate. This choice is strategic. It allows the narrative to explore dark possibilities without explicitly claiming causality. In sad terms, this is how a story remains emotionally devastating while staying just ambiguous enough to avoid outright assertion. The repeated emphasis on silence is equally intentional. Rob Reiner is described as someone who endured quietly, who avoided burdening others, who chose restraint over confession. Silence becomes both a character trait and a tragic flaw. The audience is led to question whether silence is noble or dangerous, whether strength without expression can eventually turn inward and collapse. This theme resonates deeply in contemporary culture, where conversations around mental health, masculinity, and emotional labor are increasingly prominent. Importantly, Part 2 does not resolve anything. It refuses closure. Instead of answers, it offers questions. What is a father supposed to do when love is not enough? When support does not guarantee safety? When every decision risks making things worse? These questions are not meant to be solved. They are meant to linger. The unresolved nature of these fears mirrors the unresolved nature of the real-world situation, and that parallel amplifies the emotional weight of the story. The narrative then briefly pulls back to remind viewers of Rob Reiner's creative legacy. Films like The Princess Bride and When Harry Met Sally are referenced not as achievements, but as extensions of his worldview. Stories built on kindness, patience, and quiet understanding. This reframing suggests that Rob Reiner did not merely direct warmth on screen. He practiced it off-screen. His art becomes evidence of his character, reinforcing the emotional portrait already established. Yet even here, the video avoids celebration. There is no triumphant montage of success. The focus remains inward. What matters is not what he made, but how he lived, how he listened, how he stayed present. By subordinating legacy to humanity, the narrative ensures that the sadness remains grounded and personal, rather than drifting into admiration that might dilute the pain. By the end of Part 2, the viewer is fully immersed in a dual tension. On one level, there is sympathy for Rob Reiner as a father navigating an impossible situation. On another, there is an emerging awareness of how stories like this function in the digital age. The emotional truth feels undeniable, even as the factual boundaries remain blurred. This is not accidental. It is the engine of the video's virality. People share what they feel, not what they can verify. Within the sad structure, Part 2 serves as the deepening phase. The audience has already been hooked emotionally. Now they are invited to carry that emotion forward, to invest more fully, to prepare for the next turn. Whether that turn leads to clarification, contradiction, or further complication is secondary. What matters is that by this point, the story no longer belongs solely to its subjects. It belongs to the audience. By the time the story reached its third movement, the question was no longer whether the audience believed it. Belief had already done its work. The more relevant question became why the story felt necessary, and what it revealed not only about Rob Reiner, but about the modern relationship between grief, media, and meaning. At this stage, the video's focus subtly widens. Rob Reiner is no longer only a father, a friend, or a private presence. He becomes a symbol, not of success, but of quiet endurance, not of Hollywood excess, but of restraint. In doing so, the story answers a cultural hunger. Audiences are increasingly drawn to figures who appear gentle in a world perceived as loud and aggressive. Rob Reiner's on-screen legacy of humane storytelling is retroactively aligned with a personal mythology of kindness, patience, and moral gravity. The alignment is emotionally satisfying, even if it rests more on interpretation than documentation. This is where the boundary between tribute and construction becomes most fragile. The video does not explicitly invent facts, but it arranges possibilities in a way that feels conclusive. The repeated emphasis on fear, silence, and paternal helplessness encourages viewers to connect dots that are never officially drawn. The absence of denial is mistaken for confirmation. Ambiguity becomes evidence. In sad terms, this is the dangerous beauty of suggestion. The audience completes the story themselves, and in doing so, becomes invested in its truth. The presence of Billy Crystal continues to function as emotional insulation. His voice, his perceived sincerity, and his long association with warmth and humor act as a shield. The viewer feels protected from manipulation because the messenger feels trustworthy. Yet this trust is precisely what allows the narrative to move into darker territory without resistance. Questions about guilt, regret, and responsibility are allowed to surface not because they are proven, but because they feel emotionally coherent within the story's frame. Part 3 also marks the moment where personal grief intersects with public consumption. The video acknowledges, indirectly, that this story is being watched, shared, and discussed by millions who never knew Rob Reiner personally. The intimacy of a narrative is paradoxical. It is private pain rendered public and public attention rendered intimate. The audience is invited to mourn, but also to participate. Comments, reactions, and shares become rituals of belonging. Grief turns communal, even performative, without necessarily losing sincerity. This raises an uncomfortable tension. When does empathy become appropriation? When does honoring a life slide into using that life as a vessel for unresolved collective emotions? The video does not ask these questions outright, but they hover beneath every frame. The sadness it generates is real, but it is also productive. It produces engagement, loyalty, and algorithmic momentum. Sad, in its most honest form, does not deny this. It examines it. The narrative then leans heavily into retrospection. Scenes from films associated with Rob Reiner are mentally replayed by the audience. Dialogues once remembered as light now carry new weight. Silences once seen as comedic pauses feel contemplative. The past is rewritten through the lens of loss. This is not deception. It is how memory works. But it is important to recognize that meaning is being reassigned after the fact. The story reshapes legacy not by changing events, but by changing interpretation. In this phase, the audience begins to project themselves fully into the story. The figure of the father who stays, who waits, who loves without guarantees becomes universal. It no longer matters whether every detail is accurate. What matters is that the emotional outline fits experiences many viewers recognize. Addiction, distance, fear of doing the wrong thing, the unbearable uncertainty of loving someone you cannot save. These themes transcend biography. They belong to the human condition. Yet, sad demands a moment of restraint here. The power of Part 3 lies in acknowledging that emotional truth does not automatically equal factual truth. The story feels right, but feeling right is not the same as being right. This distinction does not weaken the narrative. It strengthens it. It allows the audience to hold compassion without surrendering critical thought. It invites reflection rather than conclusion. The third part, therefore, becomes a mirror. Viewers are no longer looking only at Rob Reiner or Billy Crystal. They are looking at their own habits of delay, their own unreturned messages, their own assumptions that there will always be time. The story works because it shifts responsibility gently but decisively onto the audience. The sadness is no longer external. It is internalized. In Sad Structure, Part 3 is the turning point. The audience has been guided from shock to empathy to identification. Now they are prepared for reckoning. Not legal reckoning, but emotional and ethical reckoning. How stories are told. Why certain stories rise above others. What we choose to amplify, and what we risk losing when we allow emotion to substitute for verification. By the end of this part, Rob Reiner exists in multiple forms simultaneously. As a real person with a documented career. As a father navigating fear. As a symbol of quiet goodness. And as a narrative construct shaped by the needs of those telling and consuming the story. None of these forms cancels the others. They coexist, layered and unresolved. What comes next is inevitable. Once emotion has been examined, the story must confront consequence. How narratives like this influence perception. How they shape reputations in real time. And how responsibility shifts when grief becomes content. That is where Part 4 begins, not by denying the sadness, but by asking what it costs and who ultimately pays that price. The figure at the center of this process remains Rob Reiner, but the way he is seen begins to change. He is no longer only the subject of grief. He becomes a reference point. Headlines, comment sections, and reaction videos begin to orbit the same emotional core, repeating fragments of the original narrative until repetition itself creates authority. What began as a dramatized tribute now risks being absorbed as accepted truth. This is the quiet danger of viral mourning. The tone of reverence discourages scrutiny. Questioning feels disrespectful. Asking for confirmation feels cold. In this environment, ambiguity does not remain ambiguous for long. It solidifies. Nuance thins. Viewers begin to speak about the story as if it were settled, even when key details were never established. The line between honoring a life and defining it becomes increasingly difficult to see. At this stage, Billy Crystal occupies an even more complex position. He is no longer just the emotional lens. He becomes the guarantor of sincerity. Because the story was framed through his supposed voice, many viewers treat its implications as validated. The power of perceived proximity takes over. If someone this close was involved, then the feelings must be facts. The grief must contain truth. The audience rarely pauses to ask where the boundary lies. Part 4 challenges that assumption without dismissing the pain. It acknowledges that grief often seeks coherence. People want to understand why something ended the way it did. In the absence of complete information, narrative fills the gap. Fear becomes motive. Silence becomes evidence. Love becomes proof of struggle. None of these leaps are malicious. They are human, but they carry weight. As the story circulates, Rob Reiner's legacy subtly shifts. He is no longer remembered first for his films or creative philosophy. He is remembered for the emotional frame imposed at the moment of loss. The gentle father, the quiet sufferer, the man who carried a private burden too heavy to share. This version may be compassionate, but it is also reductive. A life that spanned decades, collaborations, and contradictions risks being compressed into a single emotional note. This compression is not accidental. Digital storytelling rewards clarity of feeling over complexity of truth. SAD thrives in this space because it understands that audiences are not seeking dossiers. They are seeking resonance. But Part 4 insists on asking what is lost when resonance becomes the only metric. When a person's final chapter eclipses the chapters that came before. When grief becomes the lens through which an entire life is retroactively interpreted. There's also the question of those left behind. Families, collaborators, and friends must live with the echo of a story they did not fully control. Public empathy can be comforting, but can also be invasive. Every shared clip, every comment of sorrow, every speculative thread extends the narrative further from the people most affected by it. Grief becomes something observed rather than experienced. Participation replaces privacy. Part 4 does not accuse. It contextualizes. It recognizes that modern audiences are trained to respond to emotional cues, to align with stories that feel morally legible. The idea of a good man suffering quietly fits a cultural script that values restraint and endurance. It reassures viewers that kindness existed, even if it was not enough to prevent tragedy. That reassurance has power. It also has consequences. The story now exists independently of its origin. It no longer requires the original video to persist. It is repeated in paraphrase, in memory, in tone. Each repetition simplifies. Each simplification removes uncertainty. Eventually, the story feels complete, even if it never truly was. This is how narratives settle into collective memory. Within the SAD framework, Part 4 is the ethical pause. It asks the audience to consider their role, not as consumers of sorrow, but as participants in meaning-making. To recognize that sharing a story is not neutral. That believing something because it feels right does not absolve responsibility. That empathy and caution are not opposites, but partners. Rob Reiner's work often suggested that stories did not need to shout to matter. They needed space, patience, and honesty. Part 4 invites the audience to apply that same principle here, to allow room for what is unknown, to resist the urge to close the story prematurely, to honor a life without finalizing it into a single interpretation. As this part ends, the sadness has changed shape. It is no longer sharp. It is reflective. The audience is no longer held by grief alone, but by awareness. Awareness of how easily stories can harden. Awareness of how memory is shaped by timing and tone. Awareness that what feels compassionate in the moment can become definitive in the long run. At this stage, Rob Reiner exists less as a current subject and more as a constructed presence. The narrative that formed around his name begins to stabilize. It is repeated in similar language, with similar emphasis. Quiet, kind, burdened, devoted. These descriptors, drawn from an emotionally charged moment, start to feel permanent. They may be accurate in part, but accuracy is no longer the primary driver. Familiarity is. This is how legacy quietly shifts, not through official biographies or retrospectives, but through emotional shorthand. People remember how a story made them feel, and that feeling becomes the frame through which everything else is interpreted. Films once discussed for their craft or cultural impact are now revisited through the lens of loss. Scenes feel heavier. Dialogues feel prophetic. Even humor is tinged with melancholy. The past is not changed, but it is recolored. Part 5 asks whether this process honors or confines. To remember someone as gentle and selfless is not an insult. But when those qualities become the only accepted version, complexity fades. Rob Reiner was not only a listener. He was also a decision-maker, a leader on set, someone who navigated conflict, pressure, and compromise. Reducing a life to a single emotional note risks turning a human being into a symbol, and symbols cannot speak back. The same applies to the role of Billy Crystal within the story. His presence continues to shape perception, even in absence. The idea that grief was voiced through him gives the narrative a sense of moral grounding. Yet over time, The distinction between what was said, what was implied, and what was inferred begins to blur. The audience remembers the feeling of sincerity more clearly than the boundaries of fact. This blurring is not a failure of memory. It is how memory works. Human recollection favors coherence over precision. Stories that resolve emotionally are easier to carry forward than stories that remain open. Part 5 acknowledges this tendency without condemning it. The desire for closure is natural, but closure achieved through simplification comes at a cost. Another layer emerges here, one less visible but equally important. The people closest to the subject must now live with a version of the story that has escaped their control. Private relationships are reinterpreted publicly. Motivations are guessed at. Silence is filled in. Even compassion, when multiplied at scale, can feel heavy. Being remembered can be a burden when remembrance becomes definition. Part 5 also confronts the audience with a quieter truth. The sadness that drew them in was not only about Rob Reiner. It was about themselves, about postponed conversations, about trust in later, about the fragile assumption that presence can always be renewed. The story resonated because it aligned with a universal vulnerability. That vulnerability does not disappear when the story ends. It lingers, shaping behavior in subtle ways. Some viewers respond by reaching out, by calling someone they have not spoken to in a while. Others simply absorb the feeling and move on. Neither response is wrong, but SAD insists on recognizing that stories have afterlives. They influence how people see not only the subject, but the world around them. That influence deserves attention. In this part, the tone deliberately softens. There is no accusation, no warning, no dramatic reveal. Only a recognition that remembering responsibly requires patience. It requires resisting the urge to finalize meaning too quickly. It requires allowing contradictions to exist without forcing them into resolution. Rob Reiner's films often left space for the audience. They trusted viewers to find their own way through emotion without being instructed what to feel. Part 5 invites the same approach here. To remember without reducing. To feel without concluding. To acknowledge loss without turning it into a single, closed narrative. As time passes, stories like this will continue to surface. They will follow the same structure, use the same cues, aim for the same emotional depth. SAD does not reject that pattern. It seeks to illuminate it, to help the audience recognize when they are being invited not just to mourn, but to participate in meaning-making. By the end of Part 5, the question is no longer about what happened, or even about what was said. The question is about stewardship. How do we carry stories of loss without turning them into instruments? How do we honor lives without flattening them? How do we allow grief to exist without demanding that it explain everything? This is not a call to disengage. It is a call to slow down, to sit with uncertainty, to accept that some stories do not belong to us, even when they move us deeply. What remains, after the sadness has done its work, is a choice. To remember with care, or to remember with certainty. At this point, Rob Reiner recedes from the center of speculation and returns to something closer to presence. Not the presence of a figure being interpreted, but the presence of a life that existed in layers, many of which were never meant to be fully seen. The story no longer needs to explain him. It needs to allow him complexity without resolution. The earlier parts of this narrative were driven by proximity, the feeling of standing close to a moment of loss, the sense that something intimate had been revealed. But intimacy, when sustained too long in public, can become distortion. Part 6 acknowledges that there is a point at which continued examination begins to intrude rather than illuminate. The line between care and consumption becomes visible. This is where restraint becomes meaningful, not as denial, but as choice. To stop adding new interpretations, to resist filling every silence with inference, to recognize that some questions are not unanswered because they were overlooked, but because they were never meant to be answered publicly. The absence of clarity is not always a failure. Sometimes it is a boundary. The role of Billy Crystal also shifts here. He no longer functions as a narrative anchor, but as a reminder of something simpler. Friendship, presence, shared time that does not require explanation. His perceived grief was powerful because it was recognizable, not because it unlocked hidden truths. In stepping back from interpretation, the audience is invited to return to that simplicity. Part 6 also confronts a subtle discomfort, the realization that the story felt complete at several points already, even though no official conclusion was ever reached. That feeling of completion came not from facts, but from emotional rhythm, beginning, deepening, reckoning, reflection. The structure itself created closure. Recognizing this does not cheapen the experience. It clarifies it. What remains is the question of silence. Silence has appeared throughout this narrative as both refuge and threat. It was framed as kindness, as endurance, as love that did not demand attention. It was also framed as risk, as something that hid fear and deferred action. In Part 6, silence is rebalanced. It is neither idealized nor condemned. It is acknowledged as human. Allowing silence now means allowing the story to rest, not to be forgotten, but to be held without pressure. This is difficult in a culture trained to extract meaning continuously. But sad, at its most honest, recognizes that meaning can also emerge from stopping. Rob Reiner's films often ended without excess. They trusted that the audience would carry something forward without being told what that something was. This part follows the same principle. It does not offer a lesson. It offers space. Space for memory to breathe. Space for uncertainty to remain intact. For the audience, this can feel unsatisfying at first. There's a reflex to ask what comes next, what finally explains everything. Part 6 gently resists that reflex. It suggests that the desire for a final answer may say more about the viewer than about the subject. That wanting resolution is natural, but not always necessary. The sadness that began this journey has changed form. It is no longer heavy. It is quiet. It no longer pulls attention inward. It allows attention to move outward again, toward one's own life, one's own relationships, one's own silences. In this way, the story completes its most important work without announcing it. Part 6 is therefore not an ending, but a pause that honors limits. It marks the moment where the narrative acknowledges that continuing to speak risks saying less, not more. That remembering responsibly sometimes means stepping back. What comes after this is not another revelation, but a return to context, to the understanding that no story exists in isolation, that lives are larger than their final chapters, that grief does not need to be endlessly interpreted to be real. At this distance, Rob Reiner no longer stands at the center of speculation or analysis. He stands where he always belonged, within a larger landscape of work, relationships, contradictions, and moments that never entered any narrative at all. The story that unfolded around his name was never truly about uncovering hidden truths. It was about recognition of fragility, of time, of the way presence can matter more than visibility. What remains now is not a verdict, but an afterimage. The emotional arc has completed its work. The audience has been led from shock to empathy, from empathy to reflection, from reflection to restraint. Nothing more needs to be added. In fact, adding more would risk turning a lived life into an object, something to be examined rather than remembered. The role of Billy Crystal resolves here as well. He does not remain a narrator or a symbol. He returns to what he always represented in this story, a witness, not to events in a factual sense, but to years shared, moments noticed, silences respected. The power attributed to his presence was never about authority. It was about familiarity, about trust earned slowly over time. And trust, once it has served its purpose, does not need to be reiterated. Part 7 invites the audience to step out of the narrative frame and back into their own lives. This is where sad completes its cycle. The sadness that first drew attention has transformed into something less dramatic but more durable. Awareness. Awareness of how easily stories fill gaps. Awareness of how quickly emotion can harden into belief. Awareness of how tempting it is to seek finality where none is possible. The story does not end with a lesson spelled out. It ends with an atmosphere. The same atmosphere that opened it. Quiet, stillness, a sense that something important passed through, leaving behind a subtle change rather than a clear conclusion. This mirrors life more closely than any definitive ending ever could. Rob Reiner's films rarely insisted on being remembered for spectacle. They trusted the audience to carry something forward on their own terms. That trust is echoed here. The narrative steps back and allows viewers to decide what stays with them. A line, a feeling, a question, or simply the reminder that later is never guaranteed. Part 7 also restores balance. The story is returned to proportion. A life is acknowledged as more than its final chapter. Grief is recognized as real without being endlessly mined. Silence is respected without being romanticized. In this way, the narrative resists the pressure to become a statement. It chooses instead to become a pause. There is a temptation, especially in digital storytelling, to ensure that every arc closes cleanly, to provide a takeaway that can be summarized, shared, or quoted. SAD refuses that temptation at the end. It understands that some experiences are meant to remain unresolved, not because they lack meaning, but because their meaning is personal. The closing of this story is therefore an opening of another kind, an opening for the audience to look differently at the stories they encounter next, to notice how emotion is shaped, to ask where feeling ends and assumption begins, to carry empathy alongside caution, rather than allowing one to replace the other. As the narrative fades, Rob Reiner is not fixed into a single image. He remains plural: director, collaborator, father, friend, listener. All of these coexist without needing to be reconciled into one definitive version. That plurality is not a weakness. It is a sign of life. The final frame does not demand remembrance. It allows it. It leaves space for silence to return, not as absence, but as respect. And in that space, the story does what it was always meant to do. It steps aside. This is where SAD ends. Not with certainty, not with closure, but with care.